Hello friends, welcome back to the next session on operations planning, scheduling and control. Now let's begin with our learning. In this particular session, we'll be able to understand and deal with the concepts of service sequencing, the learning objectives. At the end of this particular session, the learners will be able to understand and deal with or understand what do we mean by the concept of service sequencing, what are the various activities that have been conducted in service sequencing, and how do service sequencing is applied in a business organization. Now let's understand what do we mean by service sequencing. Now, in a certain manufacturing organization, all the activities that have been undertaken are always conducted on the basis of lean manufacturing processes that have been implemented based on either the organizational activity may be related to a job shop activity or a flow shop activity. Usually, certain type of activities that have been conducted in the organization are the best option that has been utilized is the flow shop. So, when there is a proper combination of the lean manufacturing processes and the flow shop into existence, the procedure or the activities that have been organized in a manufacturing concern are also often very important and profitable nature to the organization, and hence the service sequencing implies a certain consideration about how the benefit to the organization can be created and how it can create a value to the organization. So in this case, when we start up a certain activity in terms of a flow shop, the manufacturing unit or a department has to see that all the activities are more efficient, and accordingly the workshop or a project of a certain consideration is been completed in this specified time period, and hence the sequencing of all those activities either related to goods or either related to services is essentially required. Now let's understand what is the procedure for activities that has been performed. So the sequencing of services is having a certain set type of procedures or activities through which we can understand how those activities can be conducted in a specified time period. That is, now first let's understand what are the various servicing sequence of activities that has been undertaken in a business organization one by one. Initially, for a service sequencing of activity in a restaurant, how do we undertake a particular cycle? First thing, handling the reservations and allotment of tables. So initially, a restaurant or a particular hotel has to see that how many number of tables are available with them. And based on the number of reservations, they have to look at to a certain consideration that how many number of customers are expected and how the sequence of serving a particular table can be done. Based on the availability or identification of number of tables, the allotment of tables has to be done. For those particular consideration, a certain code word or a code number is been given, and then the codes are been allotted as to how those products can be delivered to each and every individual table. The next activity that is been undertaken is welcoming the guest and assuring the guest. So next thing that you need to do is you need to welcome a certain guest and you need to say that the guests are occupying their respective positions or the tables as and when they are coming into the organization. The next concern that we have to look for is that is the part of a sequencing of services, pouring the water and presenting the menu taking order. So in the first service that has been provided in a restaurant is the water is being served, and accordingly with the water that has been served, the menu order card is also been provided. The menu order card is a particular description which provides or which deals with what are the various products, that is the food eatables that have been provided in the hotel and or the particular restaurant, and what the customer can offer for the service. The next step that has been undertaken is servicing of foods and beverages order. So accordingly, either a customer may offer for a food, that is a breakfast or a lunch or a dinner, or he may offer initially for a food or for a beverages. So based on this consideration, a servicing of or the sequencing of those particular activities with respect to the starters, with respect to the main course, and with respect to the completion of the goods or the services or the consumption of the food can be undertaken, and the restaurant or a service industry or a hotel industry can serve you the food that is been required or that has been demanded by a consumer. Next step that one has to undertake or understand is clearing or the crumblance of dessert order or the tea and coffee order that can be served at the end of the procedure stage. So at the end of the food, that whether it is a main course or whether it is a starter or whether it is a food and beverages that has been undertaken, the dessert or tea and coffee is being served at the end of this particular sequence. So after the crumblance or the clearance of all the tables and plates has been undertaken, lastly the dessert is being served to the people, and accordingly the food is being delivered to the customer. The next step that has been undertaken is presenting the check, that is a feedback and a farewell to the respective party. So when the particular consumer either consumes the dessert order or the tea and coffee has been completed, then accordingly the bill or a particular invoice or a particular menu is been again taken back from that particular vendor, and the deal is been closed with respect to how the transaction needs to be completed. The payment consideration with respect to either in a cash mode or the online mode is been undertaken, and accordingly the feedback system mechanism is also being undertaken by a certain restaurant. After the feedback is taken from a particular customer, the farewell is been bid, and accordingly the customer moves from out of that particular restaurant. And in this way, the sequencing of a service activity is being undertaken in a restaurant. Now let's understand the standard procedures or steps that have been undertaken for the servicing sequencing that has been undertaken in the business organization. Initially, a manufacturing concern or a business organization has to consult a certain person who can be provided, who can act as a guide or who can act as a member for consultation, and accordingly he can show a true path of what activities or series of activities needs to be planned. So consultation is essentially important. The next step that has been required is the library preparation. The library preparation focuses on the concept of how the series of activities or a plan of activities can be undertaken and how it can be completed within a specified time period. So, library preparation is essentially important. Accordingly, what goods are required, what arrangements has to be made, all those study material with respect to the primary and secondary data collection needs to be set in a proper sequence, and hence all those activities needs to be organized in a well coordinated way. The concept of sequencing. In terms of sequencing, where the series of activities or the flow of activities needs to be planned, and accordingly we have to see that how those sequences can be created and how each and every single activity does not collide with each other, and the sequence of activity is being completed within the specified time period. The bioinformatics. Any information that needs to be recorded in a specified time period for which a future reference can be created. For all those particular considerations, the bioinformatics is essentially important, and hence such information needs to be processed and sourced or recorded in the organization. And lastly, observation of results. The observation of results focuses on whether the activity that was being planned was being completed or not, and if the sequence or the series of activities is being completed, whether the target that we were looking for is being achieved and or not. Now let's understand what do we mean by sequencing. So the order in which action must be completed in a chain is referred to as sequencing. So sequencing in simpler terms means what is the series of activities that needs to be undertaken in a particular organization and how those particular series or sequence of activities needs to be completed. So planning of activities for completion of a certain task is the concept of sequencing. So as a result, the next duty begins with whenever we plan a certain activity or whenever we sequence a particular activity, one has to see that how do we schedule the activity at each and every individual level. That is subdivision of activity that has been planned for a specified time period in again a smaller subunits or subsets. It's called the scheduling. So scheduling of various duties is essentially required in order to see that all those activities are being done in a well organized way, in a proper management concern, and it does not collide with each other. In operations research, what do we mean by the term sequencing? So now let's understand the term sequencing from the conceptual scenario of operations. Now, in terms of an operations research scenario, it is the process of assigning a number of jobs. Each and every single job or particular activity is an operation that can be undertaken in a manufacturing concern. May it be a finite number or maybe it an infinite number. So, certain type of service facilities can be delivered to a customer, and accordingly the machine or equipment that needs to be employed for the conduction of activity needs to be seen that what prioritization of work needs to be undertaken. Based on the prioritization of work, the output should be either minimized or maximized, and accordingly the time, cost and profit of the company should be additionally saved as and when it is been required. And hence the series of activity that has been planned in an organization should be conducted in a very effective way, and all those activities should be planned as when need arises. Now let's understand why sequencing is important in operations management. The first important perspective of sequencing in operations management is sequencing allows you to concentrate on what really matters. So what is the company really aiming for? Whether they are looking for wealth maximization, profit maximization, or increasing the product value, increasing the number of goods and services, processing a scheduled line, creating a valuable product, and so on. So prioritization is essentially important, and based on those considerations, sequencing gives you a clear understanding about what the company is really mattering for or what the company is looking for. Also, while preparing for the setbacks, In the simultaneous situation, when you are sequencing or whenever we are planning for a job shop or a sequence or a service sequencing, one has to see that what may be pros and cons that may be associated with a certain series of activities. A series of activities may create a positive result, or at times it may create a negative results to the organization. And hence, at certain stages, there may be setbacks that can be observed by the management. Some goals are more important than others. So as we have seen that in the first step, we have to prioritize what activity needs to be concentrated. On the basis of the prioritization of activities, we also needs to understand what are the goals of the organization, how the short-term goals as well as the long-term goals of the business organization can be achieved, and what importance should be given to which number of goal as per the set arrangement that has been made either by the top management or by the strategic management, assisting in planning your project and anticipating the difficulties. So when a particular plan is being prepared, one needs to understand about what is the plan of our series of activity that has been undertaken and how those series can be completed within a specified time period. And hence, planning of anticipating difficulties also needs to be arranged. Ability to focus on certain aspects of the project life cycle. So what is the project life cycle and what aspect of focus is being applicable in order to increase the profitability or in order to increase the number of operations in the organization. Now let's understand what are the various different methods of job sequencing. The number one, that is the first method, is the energy efficiency, and number two is sequencing of operations. So there may be either an energy efficient sequencing or there may be either sequencing of operation, that is a series of activities may be planned in an organization. Now let's understand what do we mean by or what are the various major key sequencing methods. The number one is DNA sequencing, number two that is RNA sequencing, number three is methylation sequencing, and lastly the high throughput sequencing. So in this way, based on the either the DNA sequence or an RNA sequencing, the sequencing of a certain product is been designed, and accordingly either it is in a horizontal position, vertical position, or a combined position. Methylation sequencing focuses on a combination of all the factors with respect to either DNA and RNA and so on. The high throughput sequencing is completely different, wherein there is no control or coordination of how activities can be conducted, and there is a free flow of movement of goods and services in the business life cycle or the product life cycle or the assembly line. Now let's understand the 5 sequencing words which are prioritarily or which are importantly used. The various words that have been used in the job sequencing or the service sequencing are the first, the next, the second, the meanwhile, the suddenly, and the finally. So these are the words which have been technically used in order to understand which activity is more prioritized and how those activity needs to be completed in a business organization. Now let us understand what are the various advantages of sequencing. The various advantages of sequencing are there is no specific table needs to be created. So no additional space needs to be created in the organization for a service sequencing. Service sequencing is a regular activity and hence a free flow of operations of goods and services can help an organization to implement the service sequencing in a very effective way. The sequencing values can be cached. So as in when or whenever feels that a cache or dumping or deletion or restoration of certain activities is required, accordingly, the servicing sequencing activities can be implemented or it can be altered within the organization. Highly scalable. Depending on the number of scales of operation that have been undertaken in the organization, the servicing sequencing activity can either be increased or it also can be decreased. And lastly, the advantage of sequencing is the sequencing guarantees that no other session or the next interval inside the organization session receives the same number. And hence, for those particular consideration, one has to understand about what are the various activities that have been conducted and how those activities can be conducted in the specified time period. Now let's understand what are the various job sequencing rules. The various job sequencing rules that have been associated is earliest due date, the longest processing time, the shortest processing time, the first come first serve basis, and the least setup hours. In the earliest due date time, whatever due date that has been set, the target or the deadline is been set for establishment, and accordingly, based on the due date that has been set, the sequencing activity is being undertaken. The longest and the shortest processing time focuses on for what longer duration the sequencing activity can be implemented and how it can be conducted in the business organization. The first come and first serve basis focuses on which activity should be coming first and which activity should be coming at the last level. And lastly, the least setup hours, wherein you have a certain target or you have a certain mode with respect to how a particular activity can be completed within the specified time period. So in a summary, we need to understand the manufacturing activity or a service activity. At every stage, the job sequencing activity can be implemented in a very effective way, and accordingly, all the production activities or schedule can be planned. The production schedule that we are preparing, it should have a certain roadmap as to what they are aiming to achieve for. That is the short-term or the long-term goals and objectives of the organization, the strategic goals of the organization, and in what specified time duration the activity needs to be completed. Always, the job sequencing or service sequencing is focusing on a well-designed production activity schedule. So it guarantees that the job and the orders that have been completed within specified time frame will be completed, and accordingly, all the compliances with respect to the completion of the job or a task will be completed within a specified time period. Now let's summarize what we have learned in this particular session. In this particular session, we have understood what is the meaning of service sequencing, what are the various activities or the uh, that have been undertaken in the service sequencing, and lastly, how do we implement a service sequencing in an organization. I hope you must have enjoyed the learning at this particular session. Thank you for your patience listening. Thank you.